Hey everyone, pardon me, Dan back with another video. Going to be doing a Vietnam gear, uniforms, and rations video. It's going to be part one, covering the uniforms portion. And then my buddy and I are going to do a review of the rations part. We're going to do a taste test on a vintage LRP and take a look at the MCI as well. So, Vietnam spanning 15 years approximately, from 1959 to 1975, saw quite a variety of uniforms and equipment used by U.S. personnel in country. But so that being said, I can't cover everything, nor do I have everything, but we have a good amount of items here in the museum, and we're going to take a look at some of the more common stuff and just get you a good overall look at the type of gear used by U.S. personnel in Vietnam. So without further ado, starting off here, we're going to look at like the more basic uniform items, and we'll work our way up to field gear, body armor, helmets, all that type of stuff. So the base uniform of most soldiers, at the height of the war, was the Pattern 3 tropical uniform here. This is an example of a new old stock, one that does not have any patches on it. But this is the third revision of this uniform. And, the war started out with a lot of Korean War and World War II uniforms still being used by the early Green Beret advisors. And then they started, as more of our regular forces arrived, they were still wearing the OD utility fatigues worn stateside. And then the Army began issuing a more specialized tropical uniform, which is what you see here. And there was a couple earlier ones. I don't have any examples of it, but this was the main one that we would have seen. And these remained in service well after the war, actually up until 1987. You can see U.S. Army personnel wearing these. So it was lightweight. Came in two types of fabric, a poplin and then the ripstop here. And then it also, in addition to coming in OD, it also came in a couple of different types of camouflage. So, but the most common one being the OD. So stateside, or not stateside, but on post, if you were, most common headgear would have been the cap hot weather, more typically referred to just the ball cap. And these weren't all that popular from what I understand. I mean, it's an okay hat, but literally is just like a baseball cap. So they were all right. More popular, and probably still to this day one of the most popular pieces of U.S. military headgear is the boonie hat, although if you've been in, a lot of you know you're rarely allowed to actually wear these. But they're great. They protect you from the sun. They're cool, and they're just a great piece of field gear or headgear for the field. So this is an example of one in the green dominant ERDL camouflage. These were also come in OD green. They'd come in tiger stripe. And there was a variety of ones that were made in country in different styles, other than this standard one. But here you can see the label on this one here. And this one's dated 68. The blouse is also dated 68. And this was a new old stock as well. So neither of these were issued. They're just leftovers from Vietnam. So now for footwear. Going into the war, my troops are still wearing the older style all-leather boots, which were, one, hot, but two, the leather itself retained moisture and began to break down in the tropical heat with mold and all of that in Vietnam. So they started looking at some designs going back to World War II and came out with the jungle boot. Now, there's a lot of different tread patterns. I don't think the ribbed pattern like this was used in Vietnam. I believe it's a post-war. Could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but otherwise the boot you see here is pretty much identical to what would have been worn in Vietnam. Now they have the drain holes here that would let moisture out, and obviously being the cotton upper, they're a lot lighter and more breathable and better suited for the heat. And then later on, they also had a version that was spike protective. There was a steel shank put in the bottom of these to protect from punji pits. If you know anything about Vietnam, you've seen punji traps, pretty nasty. So those were causing a lot of injuries. So they developed this spike protective jungle boot to address those. I do have a pair around here. but I just can't seem to locate them, so we're using that example. So another type of piece of headgear you would have seen in Vietnam was berets, although they weren't ultra common. You would see them with SOG personnel, green berets, some of the more elite forces. This is probably not an original from what I've researched, but it's an example of what an in-country made beret might have looked like, with the early camo parachute fabric and then a SOG type flash. So a lot of soldiers in Vietnam had a lot of uniforms, specialty uniforms made by the local indigenous personnel, as they were referred to. So we'll take a look at some of the personal items that soldiers would have carried with them around post and in the field. One being here a canister of sunburn preventative cream or sunblock. Came just an OD tin, a lot different than what we would be used to today in a kind of a tube, but a lot of sun in Vietnam, so that was important, especially if you're fair-skinned like myself. So that's one item. Another item, Vietnam is full of lots of bugs, so the bug juice is a common item you'd see soldiers have attached to their helmets in that elastic band around the steel pot. And this is kind of an iconic Vietnam item, was the bug juice. Apparently wasn't all that effective from what I've seen in some accounts, but great apparently for leeches. So if anyone has any comments on that, let me know. Anyone that actually might have been there and used it. Another important item would have been water purification tablets. You wouldn't want to drink the water right out of a creek or stream or river in Vietnam. A lot of things in there that make you sick, so soldiers carried a lot of these iodine tablets to purify their water. Made the water taste pretty nasty, but it was safe to drink. Another personal item here, tube of chapstick, military issue chapstick. Can't seem to get it. It's hard to read, unfortunately, because of the dark print and the dark background, but if anyone's been out in the sun for long enough, you know your lips can get pretty chapped, so that's another important item to have. And then, probably, for those of you who smoked, two important items here. This is an example of a cigarette pack out of a Meal Combat Individual. Typical 4-pack that came in them. And then here's an original Zippo. This belonged to my wife's father, who was in Vietnam. He was in Da Nang, and this was one of his Zippo lighters. So, sorry. You can see if I can get the focus out a little better. So that covers some of the personal items in the base uniform used in Vietnam. So I'm gonna get this stuff cleared out, and I'll be back and we'll take a look at some of the field gear used. Alrighty, so now we're going to take a look at some of the field gear used during the Vietnam War. And starting off here, kind of have this, took this off the wall. I have these hanging in kind of a display as they were supposed to be worn. So we're looking here is kind of a basic U.S. Army infantryman's gear loadout. Apologize for the zoom on the camera. I can't seem to adjust that much further. So we see here is a set of M56 load-bearing gear with the M56 suspenders. These were cotton canvas, and that being said, they could be heavy when wet, and being that they were cotton, they would tend to begin to rot after a certain period of time. Later in the war, they did start to introduce nylon gear. They realized that nylon held up much better in a tropical environment. It also dried quickly in comparison to the cotton, so it was better suited. But most of the gear, throughout the war, was this cotton M56 gear, which stayed in service even after the war. So, on a typical loadout, you'd have the suspenders. You have at least two 20-round general-purpose ammo pouches, which could carry M16 or M14 magazines. You'd have a first aid pouch, and here is a opened field dressing that I just stuck in there, but usually you'd have a clean, sterile, sealed field dressing in there. Water was, usually you'd see soldiers carrying, 4 canteens, 2 being the minimum, but typically you'd see more than that. Now, I know you purists, the black caps are post-war, but these canteens are war-dated, but this one has a post-war cap on it, so I do know that for the purists out there. I know people, oh, you know, you're not supposed to have the black caps. You know, I have most of these setups done for the average person to look at and to teach them about the history, and some of the stuff isn't, you know, 100% pure to the time period. But here you see an example of the nylon style covers, which was introduced with the M67 nylon gear I was just talking about. And then, you know, you have the cotton M56 pouch here. So those are 2 style canteen covers. Underneath the web gear, you have a M69 fragmentation protective vest. These are introduced... the design goes back before 1969, but there's a couple of revisions, and it was standardized in 69, and that's where it got the designation. So these were fragmentation protective. They weren't technically bulletproof, although there are accounts of them stopping some small arms fire. They're made of ballistics nylon, and these actually remained in service up and through the 1980s. So, and there was a couple different style vests. I'm going to show the other ones here after I go over the rest of the gear involved. So, flipping over, take a look. You can see the back side of the vest and the suspenders. Attached to the suspenders, you have a butt pack, a M61 butt pack, which you could also wear this high up, but typically they were worn down here. I have nothing in this for just when it's hanging on the wall, so it lays flush. But inside these small packs, they were good for, and actually this is an M56 pack, I'm sorry, not the M61. And the M56s are a little less common, so, but inside these soldiers would carry, you know, light gear. You could put your poncho, you could put some of your rations, extra socks, extra shirts, things of that nature, just some of your light gear. They were good for short patrols if you didn't need the full-on light tropical rucksack, which is kind of evolved into the more modern Alice pack. Take a look inside here. So you would carry several of these 1-quart canteens, like I said. This one being slightly post-war, 1976. And then, you know, when you exhausted the water you could carry, you would use the water purification tablets that we talked about earlier. So some other items you could see attached to the web gear would be an entrenching tool. I don't have one attached to this just because of the weight, but you know, if you needed to dig a fortification or any foxhole, soldiers would carry an entrenching tool on here. There were some different pouches too. Some guys might carry a pistol. So you have a, you know, holster and a, you know, pistol magazine pouch, grenade pouches, things of that nature. But this is kind of the basic loadout: butt pack, canteens, first aid pouch, and then your 20-round ammo pouches. So that's pretty standard of what you would have seen throughout most of the war. Like I said, there are a lot of variations. Pardon me there. The Marines wore a different set of gear. They did use some of the M56 gear, but they had their own styles as well, which I don't have a good example of here. So back in front of us here, we have another type of flak vest. This is a M52 flak vest, which was actually introduced in Korea, and it's the predecessor to the M69 that we just looked at. So main difference between this is it doesn't have a collar. So they added the collar later on, realizing that, you know, the neck being vulnerable, you wanted to protect that. And with the flak jackets, when they first introduced these ones in Korea, they were actually pretty popular. They did provide decent protection, and Korea was also much more static towards the end of the war when these were being introduced, almost like World War I. You know, guys were dug in trenches along the 38th parallel, and it's cold and wet in Korea a lot of times, so these would keep you warm, and they provided good protection. Not so much the case in Vietnam, where it was hot, humid, and the war was highly mobile. So early on in the war, you don't see a lot of guys wearing flak jackets. A couple of reasons. One, there weren't enough of a supply of them early on. Second, guys just didn't like them. They were hot, they were heavy, and you know, being that they didn't technically stop bullets, a lot of guys didn't see the value in them. It was almost seen to be like unmanly to wear one. But as the war progressed, they became much more common. You know, sometimes what they would do to address the weight issue is guys initially wouldn't carry them, but when they got, if they were moving on foot to an area and they were going to stay there for a while, sometimes they would fly them out in helicopters for the guys to put on at that point. But as the war went on, they became mandatory eventually. I think 69 or 70, they became more mandatory, at least in the Army's usage. So the Marines had their own style vest, which I'll show you here in a minute. A little different style. This was an experimental time with U.S. body armor. A lot of different experimental vests were being tried out. But this one and the M69 you just saw are probably two of the most common types of vests used. So then here we have the Marine Corps vest. This was an evolution of a vest introduced in Korea. The Marines issued their own vest in Korea. And the difference between the M69, M52, and the Marine Corps vests was that the Marine Corps, the upper part used the soft ballistics nylon. The lower part used these fiberglass plates, which you can hear. They're actually like steel plates coated in fiberglass. And I have shot one of these, and I've also talked to a sheriff's officer who had these in their riot kits during the 80s and 90s, and they shot them with some pistols, and they did stop low-velocity pistol rounds like 38, 357, 22. So they actually did provide pretty decent protection, and they remained in service into the 1980s. And this one actually is dated 29 May 1980. I have another one in the collection that is dated from the 60s, but it's not as in good shape as this one. So so the Marines, you know, they experiment with their own vests, like I said. And this one's kind of nice. It had these nice big pockets, you know, here, and then it had two smaller pockets up top. And then it also had the webbing around the bottom where you could attach. You can't see that on camera here. But it had this webbing around the bottom where you could attach stuff using the M1910 hooks from the World War II style gear, which a lot of the type of equipment was still in Marine inventory, being that they get a lot of hand-me-downs. So the standard helmet, moving on to helmets in Vietnam, was the M1, as I'm sure all of you are familiar with. Going back to World War II, remained in service till the 80s. Most commonly seen with the Mitchell cover with the green side out. This is a reversible cover with like a fall foliage on the other side. Sometimes you do see guys with the fall foliage out. This is the most common setup, and typically you'd see them with things attached. Sometimes they'd actually put camo in the loops. Other times they'd have like the bug juice and cigarette packs and stuff stuck in the band. That's kind of the iconic Vietnam steel pot helmet. The Marines, you know, they having a lot of leftovers and hand-me-downs. Some of them were still using these older World War II style camo. Even if you look at pictures from Hue City during Tet, you can see a few guys with the World War II type camo. And the Marines typically had inner tube, cut out inner tube rubber for to hold their helmet cover on, rather than the Army style elastic bands. So that just gives an example of another type of camo cover you might see on a helmet, specifically with the Marine Corps. So one last vest I'll take a look at, although I covered in another video I did, is the personal, excuse me, I'm sorry, it's a bulletproof version. It was the first bulletproof vest used by U.S. forces, and we'll take a look at that. So this being the first truly bulletproof vest used by U.S. military, it's the variable type body armor is what this was referred to, because the plates were removable and it could be worn as just a flak vest, or if you added these solid plates, it would then stop small arms fire up to a 30-06. It weighed close to 20 pounds. That being said, it was not really used by mobile infantry. It was first experimented with infantry units in, I think, 65. It was determined to be too heavy, and subsequently ended up in truck drivers, armored crewmen, and then pilots also had a similar version. It worked well in that environment, but it was just too heavy for the environment of Vietnam. So, but like I said, I do cover that in another video if you look on the channel in more in depth, but I just wanted to quickly cover it while we were talking about protective equipment. So that gives you kind of an idea of some of the different field gear used. There's a lot more. There's several different types of packs that were used, as well as just other various items. I mean, like I said, huge amounts of different gear were used in Vietnam, but just trying to cover one of the more common stuff. So from here, I'm going to move on. We're going to check out some weapons and radio equipment, and then after that we'll take a look at the rations. So hope you're enjoying so far, and then if always questions, comments, something I missed, feel free to leave it below. Alrighty, so back with the third part of this video, we're going to take a look at some weapons and other equipment from the Vietnam era. Centered to the screen here we have the M14 or M1A service rifle. This one has a shorter barrel on it, not typical of what typically when used in Vietnam. The ones in Vietnam had a bit of a longer barrel, but this is an original GI stock on this M1A or M14. So the difference between M1A and M14 is the M1A is a semi-automatic version of the M14. So M14 having a selector switch to allow it to fire in full auto. The M14 entered U.S. service in late 50s, I believe 1959, and is still in service to this day in a limited role as a marksmanship rifle, sniper rifle. It had a very short run as the standard U.S. service rifle. It was phased out the U.S. M1 Garand by 1960, and but by the midway through Vietnam, 1965, it was really being quickly replaced by the much lighter M16 series rifle, which I don't have an example of by the Vietnam A1 here. But the being a solid wood stock and firing a 30-06 projectile, this rifle was pretty heavy. I think it was upwards of 9 to 10 pounds, and you can get a feel for the difference in the round it was firing by the magazine. This being an A1 20-round M16 A1 20-round magazine, and this being a 20-round M14 magazine. You see a significant difference in the size. And I do have some 5.56 rounds laying around, but you get the idea. Especially, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this weapon. So it was great. It was reliable, it was accurate, but it was very heavy. And Vietnam, being a very highly mobile war, weight was a premium, and if you could reduce it in any way possible, that was really essential. So that's kind of why the M14 quickly was phased out. They wanted something lighter, something the soldiers could carry more ammo, and also was a little bit more easy to control in a full automatic mode. These things were, a bit of a bear to handle in a full automatic. So, but that being said, their accuracy and liability is why they're still used by civilian shooters, police, and even, like I said, elements of the U.S. military to this day. Over to the side here, we have some examples of hand grenades. Firstly being the Mark II. Now, that most of you would think of this as the World War II pineapple grenade, and that's correct. There were still stocks of these in the U.S. arsenal in Vietnam, so these saw some use in Vietnam. The most prominent grenade used in Vietnam was the Mark 26, or the lemon grenade, as you can see why I got that designation. These were introduced in the 50s during the Korean War and remained in service throughout Vietnam. They were eventually phased out in the latter half of the war for the M67, or the baseball grenade. And these are still in service today. This is what I threw in basic training. It's a little easier to grip and throw, obviously, with the shape. So those are three types of fragmentation grenades used. Also would have been used were smoke grenades in different colors, still used today to mark landing zones or targets. for artillery or airstrikes. This one being a yellow. And they also came, there was a similar shaped grenade, a little different looking. That was a white phosphorus grenade that they would carry. I do not have an example of the white phosphorus. Over here we have two examples of combat knives. Top one being an Air Force survival knife. Now these were, well, intended for pilots who were downed in combat. They were really popular with ground troops as well because they were, you know, lightweight. You had the nice serrated top. And they were just a good utilitarian knife. So, this one, I don't think there's a date on it. Let me look. I swear there was a date on this somewhere. Yep, Ontario, 10 of 76. So this one's just a post-war era, but same style that would have been used during Vietnam. The other common knife, this was a Marine Corps K-bar, but you could have seen these in Army use as well. I mean, these have been in use since World War II, still in use to this day. You know, it's a pretty good sized fighting knife, but it also had good utilitarian uses as well. So those are two of the types of knives carried. There's a variety. I mean, a lot of guys carried pocket knives and such as well. But those are two examples of combat knives. Another thing over here is a M9 gas mask. Now, chemical warfare wasn't big in Vietnam. There wasn't any chemical attacks by the NVA, but what was used was tear gas a lot of times to attempt to flush NVA and VC out of tunnels and bunkers. So they would carry gas masks when that gas was used. This is an M9, which dates back to Korea. The M17 was also used. This is an M17 A1, which is a Vietnam era mask, but it does have the later hood. These hoods weren't used during the Vietnam era. This is more of Gulf War type setup, but it gives you an example of the M17 without the drinking tube, which is what the Vietnam era ones were. So gas masks weren't carried all the time, but when the mission called for it, you will see guys carrying them on their leg or on their pack. Towards the rear here, we have a squad level PR6 radio. These were short range, only about 2 miles, but they were good for squad level communication, and that's what they were designed for. Design really goes back to World War II. These coming out in the late 40s, introduced in Korea, but you know, decent radios. But you can tell the size compared to today's walkie-talkies, or technically handy-talkies. They're pretty big, but especially with such a limited range. But there's another video I do where I compare that to the PRC-9 in our collection, the pack radio. So that's a little bit about some of the weapons, gas mask radios. From here, we're going to move on to checking out the rations, and I hope you've enjoyed our little Vietnam review here so far. Alrighty, so now I'm going to kind of just do a quick look at history and look at the some of the rations used in Vietnam. And the second half of this video, coming out this weekend, my buddy Nate and I are actually going to do a taste test on one of the long-range patrol rations here. And this is actually a menu that I have not seen on YouTube, so I think it's going to be pretty cool to get up there. But Vietnam entered in main ration being the meal combat individual, which replaced the ration combat individual, which if you look at our channel, there is a video I did on that, the 1955 RCI. But the MCI was introduced in 1959 and discontinued in 1980, and it came in a case of 12 with 4 P38 can openers. They'd be tossed inside there in the packaging like this, and then that concept being that you would split the case of 12 between 4 troops, each getting 3, so 1 meal per, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that's how it was intended to be issued. But sometimes you may only get 1 per day, depending on what was available. They typically had about 1,200 calories, so 1 per day, you'd be pretty hungry after that. The average weight of one of these was about 5 pounds, and that's, like I said, we're talking about having to, be on foot through the jungle for days at a time. you want stuff that's light. So that was one of the main issues with the MCI. Another being noise. The cans tend to clink and clank, and typically what guys would do would take them out of the box and they would put them inside their tube socks, and that would kind of keep them from making noise. And then they would keep the wax cardboard box to start a little fire if where you were at, fire was permitted, so you could cook up what was inside. We got a couple different menus. We got a tuna with a B1 unit. We got a spaghetti with beef chunks with a B2 unit. And then we have a ham slice cooked with juices with a B3 unit. The B1, B2, and B3 units are the accessory packets inside. And then the different ones would have different items. And I'll open up one. I like this tuna one's probably in the best shape, and it's complete. So I want to take a look at that before we move on to talking about the LRP. So we'll take a look inside here. This one made by the Spearing White Corp of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This one Universal Folding Box of Hoboken, New Jersey. And then this one Compact Inc., New Orleans. So there's several manufacturers. So if you'd open up the top one of these, first thing you'd find would be your... Alright, so sorry, the camera cut it out there. But like I said, if you open this up, the first thing you usually find on top was your spoon. Just a classic MCI spoon. After that, on top, you'd have the accessory packet. Now this one, being a Post 72, does not have the cigarettes, but has matches, chewing gum, toilet paper, coffee instant, creamer substitute, sugar, and salt. So that was typically what would be in there, plus pre-72, you'd have the cigarettes, like I showed earlier. Next you have some peanut butter. Also, a lot of times you'd see was jam. This one being made by Curran Foods. And this go really well with the crackers inside. So, and this peanut butter a lot of times is still good to this day. It's amazing how it holds up. Then we have our main entree, the tuna. And these cans are just in excellent shape. This was a really well stored MCI. So tuna there. Other, like I said, the other ones we have there, spaghetti and beef chunks. Other one, ham slice. I also got a turkey loaf floating around in here. Beanie weenies, that was another common one. And, some of these were really liked and some of them were really hated. Here's the B unit, crackers and candy. Some of these would also have, like, hot cocoa powder and things like that in it. And if you look at my other MCI videos, see I open one of these up and try it, which is pretty cool. And then, lastly, we have our side entree, which is the quartered pears. And what's cool about this is just how good its shape is. And usually when we find these tall fruit cans, they're like rotted out, swollen, and leaking. And this one's just really well preserved. This is a really well stored MCI. And that's why I decided to show this one. The other two are decent, but this one is complete. So I'm going to set that aside. And we'll take a look next at the LRP. So the LRP was the Army's way to try to phase out the MCI. They wanted something that was lighter, that didn't have the noise issue with the cans. I think the MCIs, they weighed between 4 and 5 pounds. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. I address all the details of that more specifically in another video, and I'm a little rusty now. But these were obviously significantly lighter because they were freeze-dried. And that technology came out of the space program and rolled into military rations. And these were first tested in the field, I believe, in 1964. And initially were supposed to completely phase out the MCI, but a couple issues. One, you had to add water, and water already being a premium in Vietnam, it wasn't, you already can only carry so much. And if you purified water with your tablets and added it to the food, well, that make it taste funny. And then if you were eating it dry, which it does say you can do, that's already thirst-provoking of itself. So it kind of became a limited use ration. A limited use 24-hour ration was kind of what they decided to do with it. So special forces units, long-range patrols, hence the name, could carry, if you carried 4 or 5 of these and you eat one a day, well, that gets you through a week of a patrol. But they didn't have the you're talking maybe 1,000, 1,200 calories per day while humping all that gear out in the field. You couldn't sustain on these for a very long period. They remained in use up until the early 80s when the MRE came out, and they kind of fell out of use at that point, but then they did make a comeback in the 90s, and they're still around to this day, although the current ones, while still lighter than an MRE, have a lot more in them. And if you look on video channels like Steve 1989 or RC Gusto, Old Smoky, they do cover a couple of the old ones as well as the new ones, so you can kind of see a comparison. And this menu I'm pretty excited about. We're going to check out in the last part of the video with my buddy Nate. It's chili con carne, which I have not seen anyone review that menu, and I'm hoping it'll be pretty good. So another one I have here is menu number 4, beef with rice. And so this one I had cut open so I can show people what the inside looks like, and so we'll take a look at the contents. So you have the accessory packet once again, which has a cornflake bar, cocoa beverage, matches, coffee, cream, sugar, and a dental stimulator, which is basically a fancy word for a toothpick. So that was, you had the calorie contents of the granola bar and the cocoa beverage powder there. And then really the last part we really had was just the main entree. As you can see, there's not a lot to this. Now the main entree they were stored inside these cardboard sleeves to protect the vacuum seal of the packaging. And you know, so you can see here, beef with rice. And I cover this in more detail in another video, but it gives you an idea. I mean, this is it. So you got a granola bar in this compared to what comes in the MCI, but you get the weight trade-off. So these rations both had a place, you know, and they were both honestly, elements of both were really liked by troops. And a lot of times, if they had access to both, they would mix and match them up. You know, they would take elements of either one and, you know, put it in their packs and you know, be on their way. So still issuing the same type of spoon. And then, you know, some of these have 2 toilet papers in them. I think this one just has 1. Or is there 1 in the packet? Nope, you just get this one. But I think I've seen some of these with 2 packs of the toilet paper, or butt ration, as Old Smoky likes to call it. So that gives you really a look at the 2 types of rations used in Vietnam, the MCI and the LRP. And like I said, both had their you know, pros and cons. And we're going to take a look at tasting this chili con carne, open it up and looking at the contents here in the next part of the video. Hope you're enjoying this Vietnam review so far. And like I said, questions, comments, you know, leave it below. Always looking for feedback. And like I said, be sure to check out some of the other guys, MRE Info, Steve, Old Smoky, RC Gusto, great guys with some really great videos.